Hi, everyone. I'm Tom Knowlton, CEO of CSR Talent Group. Our network is comprised of hundreds of CSR, ESG, and sustainability professionals, and we're here to help you find the talent you need to achieve your impact goals. Today, we're pleased to have someone from our network, Eliza Erskine, who has decades of experience in sustainability, provide some practical tips on how to approach your Scope 3 emissions.
Hi everyone, I'm Eliza Erskine. I'm really excited to be here as part of CSR Talent Group's Experts in Action. Today, I'm going to talk through some Scope 3 emissions reduction strategies and how companies can start reducing Scope 3 emissions within their supply chain. So since 2018, I've been working directly with mid-market companies, both public and private, on holistic ESG strategies. So that looks like anything from climate reduction to carbon footprints to helping companies consider which areas of ESG they should be focusing on, kind of everything in between. So I'm excited to go through and share some tips and tricks for how you can reduce Scope 3 emissions in your own supply chain. Okay, so when we think about reducing Scope 3 emissions, to kind of set the stage and introduce this, when you are looking at your own value chain, you've done a carbon footprint. In order to reduce your own Scope 3 emissions as a company, you need the company that is making those emissions to reduce. So if you are a food company and you're buying sugar, there are emissions associated with that. The company making the sugar needs to reduce their emissions so that you can reduce the emissions that you're reporting when you buy that sugar. So it really becomes this kind of cycle of working together, companies engaging with each other to reduce. And there's a lot of discussion and interaction on ways to do that and what that looks like. So companies that have taken this step of beginning to reduce their emissions are very often engaging with companies in order to make those reductions. So I want to talk a little bit about, before we get into how do you actually reduce, what are some things that you should do ahead of time. So again, we're talking about Scope 3 emissions, which means at this point you should have done a complete carbon footprint. So you'll have done your own Scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon accounting. You will have an understanding of where your emissions are and what your Scope 3 footprint looks like. A lot of what we're going to be talking about and what I'm going to be going through will talk about different Scope 3 categories. I find that a lot of my clients or companies I talk to have a lot of their Scope 3 and purchase goods and services, but a lot of these strategies you can apply to any of the 15 categories that you'll see. So once you have a completed carbon footprint, you're starting to think about, okay, I understand where my hotspots are. The next thing that's critical to do is to make sure that you have a listing of those suppliers and what their associated emissions are. I like to be able to sort a supplier by how much you're spending with them and then what their associated emissions are. So once you have those two data points, that helps set the stage for this engagement that we're going to talk about and get into some kind of tips and how you can start to think about those different things. Okay, so tip number one, let's say you've just completed a carbon footprint, you want to start thinking about how to reduce Scope 3 emissions. Now I see a lot of companies that are in a position of having set a science-based target. So they have committed to, say, a 60% reduction in their Scope 3 emissions by 2030. Or they have said that they're going to make another emissions reduction in the future, and they want to make sure that they really understand where those emissions are, what their supply chain looks like, and if that type of emissions reduction is possible. So at this point, before you start to think about engagement, I think it's really critical to be clear on what your supplier engagement strategy is and what the desired outcome is. So for example, if you have already set an emissions reduction target, your desired outcome is very clear, and then it's helpful to communicate what desired outcome you would like from the supplier that you're engaging with. So what I see a lot of companies do is just to go to a supplier and say, hey, let's talk about climate change. Let's talk about sustainability. We have done our carbon footprint. Let's just have a conversation. There's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. But in a time when everybody's strapped for time, everybody has a lot of things going on, it's much more effective to go to a supplier and be able to have something that you need from them. So internally, being able to say, okay, we are going to request that our tier one suppliers all set a science-based target, or our tier one suppliers all have a reduction target. I think for the first meeting or conversation, very often what I see, and honestly, what I recommend is to go to that meeting and say, hey, we have set a carbon footprint. We've created our own carbon footprint. Your emissions are part of that. For the next 2, 3, 4 years, we are going to be requesting emissions data from you. So going to the supplier, perfectly reasonable. If you aren't ready yet to set your own science-based target, you don't want to ask for emissions information from them, to be able to go and say, okay, this is what we're going to talk about, and we are going to request emissions data from you. So really being clear on what you want to engage with the supplier about, and then what the desired outcome of that conversation is, I think really helps set the stage nicely. Any supplier engagement is not a one and done conversation usually. So being able to set the stage of, this is what we need from you, and then this is the desired outcome that we would like, really makes a significant difference. Okay, tip number 2, I have to shout out my friend Sam for giving me this tip. I think it's a great one. Anytime you're engaging with a supplier, having questions in outreach and RFPs, I think it's really helpful to add a question to all of that outreach. And that question is, do you need help with sustainability? As you're engaging with suppliers, companies of all sizes and are at all levels of sustainability. So somebody like a Coke or a Pepsi or a Microsoft or a Walmart that has been at this for decades at this point, they're in a very different position than maybe a mid-sized private company that is getting their second CDP request. So being able to talk to a company and say, hey, do you need help with sustainability? When you are going to them and hoping that they will reduce emissions, if you have a better idea of, okay, we do need help, and maybe they're a huge portion of your emissions, being able to understand, okay, they're going to need some hand holding from us. It would be great if we could provide resources, compared to a Microsoft, for example, that says, nope, we're great, we've got it figured out. Just having your own understanding of, okay, this is somebody that might need more help with sustainability that we should really focus our efforts on engaging with, because the part of what makes this employee engagement so overwhelming, or the supplier engagement so overwhelming and so difficult, is one, the volume of suppliers that a lot of companies have to deal with, and the fact that everybody is at different levels. Everybody's on their own journey. So being able to tier and segment suppliers and say, okay, these 10 suppliers need help. Great. What are we going to do with them? These other 10 suppliers don't need help. Great. We can ignore them and focus our efforts on those that really need help. I think that's really critical, and another tip that I would recommend. Okay, so the third tip is to either create or find industry groups and then connect adjacent suppliers. So again, back to this food example, if we think about, for example, packaging suppliers or ingredients suppliers, most companies have multiple packaging suppliers, and being able to say, okay, we know that of our top, say, 50 suppliers that are really the majority of our emissions, 12 of them are packaging. Being able to segment, and instead of going to one by one to the packaging suppliers, maybe you set up a quarterly industry meeting where you're meeting with all of those packaging suppliers and saying, okay, let's share strategies and talk about different sustainability opportunities. Let's share emissions reduction strategies. I think that can be a great option. The other thing to think about is, if you do not want to be creating those groups, there are industry groups that exist. I think something really special about sustainability, especially emissions reduction, is there's no gatekeeping in the same way that there might be with other functions. At this point, we all need to work together and collaborate in order to solve climate change and reduce global emissions. This is a global thing. So being able to go and find industry groups, there's different councils, there's leadership groups, the Supplier Purchasing Leadership Council. There's, I think, a big biotech scope 3 group. There now are these kind of working groups, industry groups that are sharing strategies and helping companies reduce emissions. Because what ends up happening is you're engaging with a supplier and you'll say, okay, we've set this target, we need you to reduce emissions. And they might say, how do we do that? What does that look like? You want to be able to empower that supplier to reduce emissions, feel like they can make a change, and having an industry group to share with them, or saying, hey, these are our top sort of our own supplier groups. We meet every quarter to talk about emissions reductions, talk about sustainability. I think that can be a huge benefit and really helps the supplier that you're working with be able to reduce emissions more efficiently and faster. Okay, so tip number 4, creating procurement incentives. This is something that I think a lot of companies are starting to think about. I'm certainly seeing it with smaller suppliers that might be in the value chain of a bigger supplier, you know, a company like Salesforce saying, okay, we need everybody to set a science-based target to do business with us. Microsoft has made similar pronouncements talking about, in order to do XYZ with us, we need you to have an emissions reduction target. So as companies get to that, that seems, you know, that's something that's Microsoft specific, a giant company specific. But even if you're a mid-sized company or not a Microsoft size, there are kind of right-sized incentives that you can think about. So things like terms, price, thinking about where you're going with new business opportunities. So let's say that you have said, okay, we are going to use either an EcoVadis scorecard or a CDP scorecard or similar. And every supplier we have that scores a B or above on CDP, we will give them better terms, or we will go to that group first with new business opportunities. This is definitely something that's a little more advanced. I would not recommend doing this right out of the gate, but I also think that as you're having these discussions and trying to figure out what your strategy is, this could be something that you look at now and say, we are not there yet, but by the end of 2026, 2027, you could be there. So I think it's helpful to have this understanding and be able to say, okay, in 2027, we might be in a different place. We're ready to create those different procurement incentives. Okay, and then the final tip, again, this is something that seems obvious and is part of what everybody does when they start saying, okay, we need to start tackling scope 3 emissions, but it's really, really important to sync up internally and figure out the best way to do this for your organization and what makes sense for you culturally. I think companies will get caught up when they see, you know, back to the Microsoft example, they could say, we don't feel comfortable asking everybody to set a science-based target. That's fine. It's really important to make sure that you're thinking about what makes sense for your company, you're doing what's aligned with your own values, with your own organization, and really that you're using different functions to solve this problem. Again, we talk about the collaborative nature of sustainability. If you're a sustainability professional, you will be working very closely with a procurement team to make sure that supplier engagement is working effectively. Very often, procurement teams will have very long relationships with suppliers, and you will need to use them and work together to be able to go again to that packaging supplier and say, hey, we need to talk about sustainability. We need to talk about emissions. We need to add this to regular conversations and figure out how to work together. The other example that I think comes up a lot that is helpful to think about is when you're looking at your existing procurement processes, existing procurement software, how do you fit sustainability into that instead of trying to kind of fit procurement into sustainability. So it's helpful to work with the way that processes are already happening. And again, back to that idea of maybe we're adding a question to an annual supplier survey. Maybe we already meet with tier 1 suppliers every year. Great. The people that are having those meetings should be engaging on different climate opportunities, engaging on reduction. So it's really important. And again, this is not something that's a one and done, to be able to figure out, okay, how do we work internally so that we're not wasting time engaging with suppliers that we shouldn't, or we're not wasting time trying to kind of reinvent this every year. Really taking the time to sync up internally to make sure that you're doing what you can in the most effective way, and that you're getting companies to actually start to make those reductions. So those are my tips. I hope that was helpful. If you want to talk more about this, you can reach me through CSR Talent Group. I'm always happy to talk about Scope 3 emissions, talk about what I'm seeing or what other people are doing. And I hope that you will reach out to CSR Talent Group if you have any other questions or anything else regards to sustainability. So thanks so much for watching.
That was a great presentation by Eliza. If you'd like to connect with Eliza or any of the other professionals in our network, please reach out to me at csrtalentgroup.com. And thanks for attending this presentation.